get into the latest on the Israel-Hamas conflict. We want to bring in our friend, retired Marines intelligence officer Hal Kempfer. Thank you for joining us, Hal.
Thank you, Austin.
First, let's get to the news of the day. Let's pull up this tweet here. So, what we have is this tweet from the UN. We want to cover this story for the next couple of days because it is a big deal. Israel is prepping to defend itself at the top UN court against accusations of genocide in Gaza. The case was brought by South Africa. We likely have 2 days of hearings ahead of us, Hal. The U.S. says the claim of genocide is meritless. What is the difference between genocide and what we're seeing in Gaza?
Well, genocide, by definition, means that you're basically doing attacks against entire people, if you will. And the charge that South Africa is making is that this is Israel is attacking the Palestinian people as a whole, and basically, you get into things like it makes inferences into the Holocaust, if you will, where Nazi Germany systematically tried to destroy all the Jewish people or Jewish peoples in Europe through this massive program of literally human extermination. It also looks at things like the what happened in Rwanda back in '94, which that clearly was a genocidal situation. Looks at the Balkans, what was happening certainly in Bosnia, where it definitely had genocidal aspects of it, and so that's what they're charging. What the U.S. position, obviously, the Israeli position is no, it's not genocide. And certainly, if you look at the numbers, if you look at the methods, the method of attacks, if you look at what they're actually targeting, it doesn't meet the legal requirements of genocide. Now, they have obviously incurred a number of, uh, of casualties across the board. And by the way, Austin, does it look like my I just froze?
No, no, we can see you. We can hear
Oh,
you.
for some reason, it looked like it froze on my end. Sorry about that. There have been a lot of casualties on the Palestinian side, and so there have been these charges. Obviously, Hamas is making these charges. Iran is making these charges, and I don't have to draw out the connection between Iran and Russia across the board. And so Russia has a very close relationship with South Africa, and to some extent, I see Russia, South Africa acting as a tool of Iran and trying to bring this charge and try to leverage the international court in order to make these charges. The U.S. position is this is absolutely meritless. It doesn't meet the legal requirements, but for some reason, it's going to go forward, and that's just the international environment. And some of that probably is some of that is because of things that senior UN officials have been saying publicly as well.
Now, the Associated Press says that Israel's decision to participate rather than boycott reflects Israel's concerns that the World Court judges could order it to halt its war against Hamas and tarnish its image internationally. Hal, is there really any chance that this war could stop for this reason?
I don't see that it's going to stop because of anything the international court does. However, being in violation of the international court could dramatically hinder Israel's ability to operate in the global marketplace. The international court can do a variety of things which will limit the ability of Israelis, particularly Israeli officials, to move around. Don't forget, there's an arrest warrant by the international court that's out for Putin. And this has dramatically curtailed his travels around the world. In fact, there's a number of major conferences. There was one conference, ironically, in South Africa that he did not go to because South Africa would have been basically would have been required to arrest him and hand him over to the international court. And obviously, Putin didn't want to go to a conference and get arrested and then stand justice in The Hague. So there was a lot of things that the court could do, and I think Israel's position is obviously this is meritless. They want to get this dismissed. I think they have an extremely strong argument in that regard. The U.S. is going to be there, as a basically we didn't boycott it per se. I think we made a decision that we can actually do more by being there than to be boycotting it. Interesting. I should point out though the U.S. is not a signatory to the international court process. We have always said we're not part of that. And one of the reasons why is because with what the U.S. does around the world, our military forces and others, we're always concerned that there could be a group of nations that come together to haul the U.S. into court or to try and do something with our personnel around the world. So we've always had a kind of an interesting relationship with the international court across the board because of that.
Reuters reports that the world court process could take years, and as the court hears the merits of the case, that's what they're going to be doing over the course of these years. Like we said, South Africa brought the case. Colombia and Brazil have expressed support for South Africa. Of all states, why is South Africa taking this step?
Again, I think it really goes back to its relationship with Russia and Russia's relationship with Iran. And Iran sees this as a way of somewhat stirring the pot, of using the international system, the international court system, the international legal system against Israel. What Hamas did to Israel on October 7th was an absolute violation of every international law you can think of. What Hamas has done using Palestinian civilians as human shields is a clear-cut violation of international law, particularly their use of, of, of putting military positions, military facilities in areas that are specifically under the Geneva Convention protected areas, like schools, like hospitals, and a variety of other things. So that's a clear-cut violation. What the argument Hamas has been making, and also its allies have been making, is that somehow this is actually a Israel has been targeting these and violating international law and targeting Palestinian civilians directly. And that has constantly been what they're trying to say. And so they're trying to use the international court process. But you're right, it can take years. It can take years to get a guilty conviction. And this war will be done, uh, whatever this is will be done long before they'll ever have a decision in this thing. So that's just but by and large, Israel's got to make a strong defense. Interestingly, the U.S. is putting pressure on Pretoria because of this. I'm sure we're also having some very frank discussions with Colombia about this as well, because of their position on this. I don't know how much discussion we're going to have with Brazil on this because well, they're a little contrarian. They're going to kind of do what they want to do, but certainly we have some leverage with Colombia. We've always had a very strong relationship with the government there, and with Pretoria, they don't want to do things that are going to make them distanced out of the international system, and they've got enough issues there that I think there's going to be a very very open discussion with them, saying, look, if this get this is a good way to get a lot of other countries kind of aligned against what South Africa is doing, and so there might be one of those discussions that takes place as well.
Secretary of State Anthony Blinken was visiting the West Bank today after a meeting with Israeli officials yesterday. Yesterday, he pressed Israel to offer a pathway to a Palestinian state. So, Hal, what did he press the Palestinians on today?
Well, this is there's been a lot of things said in this war, and not the least of which some of the things by the Israeli government, about that they're not the Israeli government's position right now. Netanyahu's position is they don't want the Palestinian Authority to be governing a post combat Gaza Strip. Obviously, the reason Hamas was in charge was because the Palestinians that lived in the Gaza Strip voted the Palestinian Authority out of office. That goes back to 2006, 2007, and voted Hamas into office. And that tells you something about how the Palestinians, not just in Gaza Strip, but also in the West Bank, feel about the Palestinian Authority. It has historically been rife with corruption. There's been tremendous administrative incompetence charges against the officials. If you look at Abbas himself, he was, as someone once said, they said he was elected to a 4-year term 17 years ago. To kind of put that in perspective, which is, it was one vote and that was it, and he's never left. And he's 89 years old and he's still there in charge. And so, what the U.S. position and the reports are that, of course, you see in this picture here, they had a nice cordial meeting. They took the picture, shaking hands for the cameras. They sat down. And the moment the doors shut, there's numerous reports that voices were very loud in the room as the U.S. was making its position very, very clear that the Palestinian Authority had to reform itself, that it had to change, that it wasn't going to have the trust and confidence of the Palestinians in Gaza, let alone the trust and confidence necessary for the Israelis to work with them until they had significantly reformed and changed what the Palestinian Authority represents. That's the U.S. position. Obviously, that's not a position that President Abbas wants to hear, but that is the U.S. position. The U.S. position has also been the two-state solution. We've said that all along, that there needs to be a Palestinian state and a Palestinian state that rules over both West Bank and Gaza. That needs to be an end state, a sovereign state that does both, and that the Palestinian Authority should be the ones that are administrating the Gaza Strip. The question really gets into, do they have the capability to do so? And if they don't have the trust and confidence of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip to do so, then it's not going to work. If the Israelis don't trust them and don't want to work with them or refuse to work with them, it's not going to work. And so there's a lot of work that has to be done to get to that point where the Palestinian Authority could be that administrative entity that basically that basically rules over a post-combat Gaza Strip, and that's what that discussion was today. And by all reports today, very interestingly, was that it was a discussion, very frank discussion, and voices were raised on both sides in that discussion that took place, and probably that's what needed to happen. In my personal view is, and I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East. There are times where you have to have very frank discussions like that because something that's being said just can't be said in the cordial language of diplomacy. It's got to be said very, very upfront. And particularly when you're talking about things like warfare, or in this case, post-warfare administration of an area that's been so heavily destroyed by war.
Let's show some video of the Red Sea. Let's pull this up. There we go. So the UN Security Council is demanding that Yemen's Houthis immediately end attacks on ships in the Red Sea. This has been a big challenge for cargo ships since November. The AP says the rebels fired their largest ever barrage of drones and missiles earlier today, but no damage was reported, Hal. Now, if the UN's demands are not met, is the next step military action? And if so, who could be the lead on that military action?
Well, Austin, the UN demand of all the demands of the Houthis probably has the least amount of teeth to it, if you will. And it took this long for the UN to actually say, hey, quit doing that, which says a lot about how the UN operates. The UN doesn't have any way to enforce that demand. However, the U.S. is in charge of a rather robust international task force with a lot of ships in there. By the way, that's within the Red Sea. Outside the Red Sea is other task force ships, and interestingly, the Indian Navy has weighed in much more heavily on this because of some of the things that the Houthis have done. That the Indian Navy is out there patrolling extensively, and the U.S. Had made it very clear with its allies that was called basically the final demand, and they made that very distinct that this was it. This was their last chance. That you have to stop doing this. And the Houthi response was what you just referenced, which is they launched the biggest barrage of missiles and drones that we have seen in any period of time during this conflict. This puts the U.S. in a rather interesting situation, along with all of our allies here. When you say that's your last and final warning, you're really kind of hearkening to the language of the red line in Syria. And we all know what happened when we didn't enforce the red line in Syria. There is a lot of pressure, and certainly U.S. credibility is on the line. When you say that's the last and final offer, what are you going to do about it? And many have looked at this to include the recently retired CENTCOM commander, General McKenzie. I've all looked at this, and I think it's pretty much uniform agreement that attacks on launch positions that the Houthis are using for drones and missiles would be something that we could see. The big question is, if we do that, would Iran enter into a war? Would they do to the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf? what the Houthis are doing to the Bab el Mandeb Strait and the Red Sea. You know, generally speaking, I think there's a lot of belief that no, they would not. They would probably understand that, and there's been so much pressure put on the Iranians, and so much very frank discussion with the Iranians as to what could happen if they were to enter this directly. That and the fact that we even gave a last and final offer, publicly like that, says that we have probably done a lot of work, and we and our allies there are ready to take this to a more direct deterrence level, and by that I mean kinetic deterrence, looking at the at various Houthi assets. Some could be afloat, some could be on land, but basically saying, look, if you're going to keep firing, and we've told you you have to stop, and you don't stop, then there's just no other way to do it. You have to eliminate their means, their capability to do so.
We'll be watching the Red Sea closely. We want to bring things back to Gaza, though. Take a look at this tweet up on the screen. The Hamas-run Gaza Ministry of Health says that over 23,000 people have been killed in Gaza since the war began. That means the Gaza Strip population has now lost 1% of its 2.3 million residents. More than 10,000 of those killed were children, and about 7,000 are reported to be still under the rubble, the health ministry says. Hal, there has no doubt been a horrific amount of civilian deaths in Gaza, but how reliable are numbers from a Hamas run entity?
Not very, and they have a history of dramatically overstating the effects of various attacks, and even when it comes back, and they had initially overstated the attack losses by 10 times more than what they actually turned out to be. The problem is, at the end of the day, the total running total numbers never seem to get adjusted. So if they say almost 500 people died in a strike, and it turns out only 50 people died in a strike, um, they may kind of tacitly kind of nod their head, but when you look at the total number, it never changed. That 500 was baked into their total number. It's not clear how many people were killed. The problem with the Gaza Ministry of Health is that the United Nations has been basically quoting them verbatim. So what happens is various media sources, various countries around the world will say this is what the United Nations is saying, and for whatever reason, the United Nations has been taking those Gaza Ministry of Health, which is literally Hamas numbers, and running with them as if they're somehow valid. And I'd like to point out a problem with that. When you see these attacks, particularly the big airstrikes, and like what just recently happened today, where they hit a position, it was in a building, and a five-story building largely collapsed. And I am not going to say that that didn't kill a lot of civilians. I'm not going to say that children weren't collateral damage in that, because I've seen some of the body bags, the video. It's very clear, and I don't know, that may have been a mistake on their part. Mistakes do happen in war, but with that, the Gaza Ministry of Health will immediately come out with numbers that are extremely exact and very high. And I look at this, I go, how is it that you are so good at doing this? Yet everywhere in the world, to include the US, Japan, Europe, all these other countries, we can never come up with numbers that exact, as you always seem to come up with. And when the building collapses and you have inferably a large percentage of those who are killed or buried under the rubble or injured under the rubble, and there is no very robust search and rescue capability to go in there and dig them out, how do you suddenly know that these numbers are accurate? And the only way that they could come up with that is they have to provide a guesstimate. And that guesstimate will look like what they want those numbers to look like, and that gets baked in. So when you get this 23,000 total, it's there really, there's a lot of that goes in there. The devil's in the details as to the accuracy. But all along since this war began, they have been overstating. And the other thing too is there'll be attacks, and every time there's an attack, they go, "Oh, it killed women and children." And then they'll go back and you look at it and you find military age men were primarily amongst those who were killed. And you go, there's a little bit of a difference here. I don't know how much of that percentage were children. I don't know how much of that percentage are women. What I do know is Hamas has a built in incentive to overstate the number of women and children killed. Obviously, any child killed in war is a tragic situation. And there have been a lot of children killed in the Gaza Strip, and that's the nature of how Hamas is arrayed, basically in civilian areas. So that has caused a lot of collateral damage. But with that said, that number is, it's big. We say 1% of the population. I can guarantee you that that is going to be quoted verbatim in the International Court of Justice when they're trying to make charges of genocide. All right, they're going to say 1% of the population. They're going to say that right off. But if you get into those numbers and you actually start analyzing them, you realize they don't have a lot of validity. That's just stuff. That's stuff they put out. I'm not saying they're completely baseless, but let me just say this: there's 30 to 50,000 Hamas fighters in there. Israel said they're going to take out all the Hamas fighters. What does that tell you? At the end of the day, you're probably looking at casualties of Hamas fighters of around 30 to 50,000. So, and now they've taken the northern area, they're in the southern area, they're moving quickly. I would expect to see a lot of casualties, certainly of Hamas fighters. When you juxtapose those two numbers, you go, could be a lot of Hamas fighters are dying, and they're mislabeling them as something else.
Is
That's
guesstimating the best that can be done right now by an entity out there, or is there perhaps another entity that might be able to eventually do a more accurate count, or is that something that typically is not possible in these types of situations?
the problem we have with this is there is no third party that is in there that can do this. That's it, believe me. If Israel had a way that they could figure this out, and they can do a lot of very interesting quantitative things. They can do a lot of interesting quantitative estimates, but there is no other entity that is on the ground that can go in and actually look inside these buildings and do this. Unlike other disasters where you'd have international search and rescue forces coming in and they would be going through the buildings, which would provide you a lot of data separate and apart from whatever the official government estimate is. A lot of different avenues. You just don't have that in the Gaza Strip. Whatever they put out is whatever Hamas says, and whatever Hamas says is whatever Hamas wants the world to believe. And so, separating ground truth from Hamas propaganda, particularly when they're quoting casualties, is extremely difficult. And I could say 3 months, we're over 3 months into this war, and to date, and I was wondering too. I was wondering if there's some sort of interesting way that Israel would put out a countermanding count, if you will. And they haven't been able to yet. And I think that just goes to the difficulty, particularly with the urban terrain and the subsurface terrain that they're dealing with the tunnels, of actually getting an accurate count of how many people are being killed and injured.
Lastly, Hal, before we go, tonight was a big night for the remaining 2024 GOP presidential candidates. I want to play you a clip of the frontrunner speaking about the war during a Fox town hall earlier tonight. Let's listen to this.
But peace through strength. They didn't want to mess around. It would have never happened in Ukraine. Russia would have never gone in. Would have never happened. The recent attack on Israel would have never happened. 0% chance that was going to happen. They see a weak president in our country, and they did something that was unthinkable.
All right. So, is there any evidence out there to suggest that the initial attacks in Israel and Ukraine only happened because Biden is in office?
I haven't seen anything. It's an interesting rhetorical, turn of phrase. And I'm sure that anyone who has formerly been president that was running for president again would probably have said, if I'd been there, this never would have happened. All right. And if they're not saying that, I don't think they're trying enough to get elected. They probably would have to say that. But the reality is, I don't know if that would have made a difference. Now, one can argue, and it has been said, that what happened in Afghanistan really shook confidence across the international system. It emboldened our enemies, and it kind of made our allies very skeptical as to our determination, and that definitely that falls. One could argue that the agreement that led to our horrible evacuation situation, our withdrawal from Afghanistan, was reached under, or was basically put in place under the previous administration, although the actual final withdrawal forces, I should say, was under the Biden administration. So, fingers have been pointed both directions on that. And I don't think we can escape that. And there's been other things. I mean, you could go back and you could point to that thing we talked about in Syria with the red line in the sand or red line with chemical weapons, and we didn't back that up. One thing I will say though is that looking back, I don't think you would have seen this massive aid flow and support led by the United States into Ukraine, if except under the Biden administration. And that is something I think is something they can definitely point to is just a massive flow of support and aid. Excuse me. Although with that said, there have been times I felt that they could have been a little more aggressive in sending certain weapon systems in, ATACMs. I think they could have been more aggressive in getting F-16s in there, but that's getting into specifics. But I will say that as a general rule, it's an interesting turn of phrase. I'm not quite sure if there would have been that level of deterrence across the board. Although, with that said, one thing that has been brought out was that the Trump administration took a very strong stance against Iran. That we withdrew from the agreement on nuclear weapons development with Iran, and we were very forceful, and that definitely had Iran very concerned. And so that there could be an argument to be made there that basically the Trump administration policy with Iran may have curtailed their ambitions, and by because of their support of their proxy Hamas, that may have curtailed their plans to conduct this attack on October 7th. So there could be something there.
Hal Kempfer, informative as always. Thank you so much for your time and have a good night.